I remember the exact sound the house made the first night after the funeral. It wasn't loud. Just a soft settling, like the walls exhaling after holding their breath for too long. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the clock above the sink, the same clock that had been there my whole life, the one my mother refused to replace even when it started losing a minute every week. The house smelled like lilies and old wood polish. People had brought too many flowers, and their sweetness had turned heavy, almost suffocating. I kept expecting to hear her slippers on the hallway floor, that slow shuffle I knew by heart. Every small sound made me look up. But there was only silence. Grief doesn't arrive like a storm the way people describe it. For me, it came like fog, thick, quiet, creeping into every room until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. I stayed in her house because I didn't know where else to go. I was 38, divorced, living in a small apartment across town, but after she died it felt impossible to leave. It was as if leaving would make her absence more real, more permanent. So I slept in my old bedroom, surrounded by the faded posters and shelves of books I hadn't touched in years. At night, I would lie awake and listen to the familiar creaks, trying to convince myself that nothing had really changed. 3 days after the funeral, I decided to start going through her things. Everyone says not to rush, but the house felt frozen in time, and I thought maybe if I moved through it slowly, drawer by drawer, I could understand something about her, or at least keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. My mother was meticulous. Every receipt, every letter, every photograph had a place. Her closet smelled faintly of lavender sachets. Her sweaters were folded in perfect stacks, soft from years of washing. I found old birthday cards she had saved, even the ones I had scribbled as a child with crooked letters and misspelled words. Seeing them made my chest ache in a way that felt both painful and strangely comforting. By the afternoon, sunlight stretched across the living room floor in long golden stripes. Dust floated lazily in the air. That's when I noticed the box. It was tucked behind a stack of winter blankets in the hallway closet, pushed so far back that I would have missed it if I hadn't been reaching for something that fell. It was a small wooden box, darker than the rest of the shelves, with brass corners worn smooth. There was a tiny lock on the front. I frowned, trying to remember if I had ever seen it before. The box didn't match anything else in the house. It looked older, almost out of place. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. At first, I assumed it held old documents, maybe insurance papers or something she didn't want lying around. But when I shook it gently, I heard something shift inside, a soft, muffled movement. A strange feeling crept into my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like curiosity tinged with unease. I searched the closet for a key but found nothing. I checked her dresser, the kitchen drawers, the little ceramic bowl where she kept spare change. No key. That night, I sat on the couch with the box in my lap, running my fingers over the wood grain. The brass lock was small but sturdy. I told myself I could leave it alone. That maybe it wasn't meant for me. But the thought wouldn't let go. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought a small screwdriver set. I told the clerk I needed it for a loose cabinet hinge. My voice sounded oddly distant, like it belonged to someone else. Back home, I placed the box on the kitchen table. The sunlight was sharp and clear, illuminating every scratch on the surface. For a moment, I hesitated. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Then I started working at the lock. It took longer than I expected, nearly 40 minutes of careful pressure and tiny adjustments. My hands shook slightly, not from effort but from a growing sense that I was about to cross some invisible line. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. I opened the lid slowly. Inside, there were several envelopes tied together with a thin ribbon, a stack of photographs, and a small leather notebook. Everything smelled faintly of paper and something older, almost like dust warmed by sunlight. My first reaction was confusion. The envelopes were addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, not my mother's neat script, but something looser, slightly slanted. All of them were addressed to her. I untied the ribbon. The top envelope was yellowed with age. The stamp dated back more than 40 years. I unfolded the letter carefully. The words inside were written in blue ink, slightly faded. "Dear Anna," it began. My mother's name. I started reading. Within a few lines, my stomach tightened. The letter was intimate, not inappropriate, but deeply personal. The writer spoke about missing her, about conversations they'd shared, about dreams for the future. I flipped to the signature. "Always, Daniel." I frowned. I didn't know anyone named Daniel connected to my mother. I read another letter. Then another. They told a story, fragments of a relationship that felt intense and complicated. There were references to arguments, to plans that had fallen apart, to something unspoken but heavy between them. One line made me pause. "I still think about what you told me, about the baby. I hope you made the choice that felt right for you." My heart skipped. The baby? I read the sentence again, trying to understand. A cold sensation spread through my chest. I kept reading, faster now, my breathing shallow. More references appeared, indirect, careful, but unmistakable. Discussions about timing, about fear, about consequences. My hands began to tremble. I set the letters down and reached for the photographs. The first photo showed my mother as a young woman, smiling in a way I had rarely seen, relaxed, almost radiant. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize. He had dark hair and kind eyes, his arm loosely around her shoulders. They looked happy. Intimately so. On the back of the photo, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "Summer by the Lake." I flipped through more photos. The same man appeared again and again, at a picnic, standing outside what looked like a small cabin, laughing. Then I found a photo of my mother holding a newborn baby. I froze. On the back, it read, "Our little miracle." My breath caught in my throat. The baby looked like me. But that couldn't be right. My father had always told me stories about my birth. My parents had been married for years before I was born. I stared at the photo until the edges blurred. My father had died when I was 22. We had never talked much about the past, but I had never questioned the basics of my family story. A low hum filled my ears. I opened the leather notebook. The first page contained a date, the year before I was born. Below it, in my mother's handwriting, were words I never expected to read. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to live with this secret." My chest tightened painfully. I read on. The entries were raw, unfiltered. She wrote about loving two people at once. About feeling trapped between duty and desire. About fear of judgment, fear of losing everything she had built. One entry made my hands go cold. "John will never know. I can't break his heart. But Daniel, he deserves to know the truth." John was my father's name. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had moved closer. I kept reading. There were entries about arguments with Daniel, about decisions made under pressure, about choosing stability over passion. Then I reached an entry dated a few months after my birth. I look at him and see pieces of both worlds. I pray he never feels the weight of what I've done. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. I closed the notebook slowly, my mind racing. Was it possible? No. There had to be some misunderstanding. I spent hours rereading everything, searching for clarity. The evidence pointed in one direction, but part of me resisted, clinging to the version of reality I had always known. By evening, I felt exhausted, as if I had run a marathon without moving. I sat at the table, staring at the box. If what I suspected was true, then my entire understanding of my family, of myself, might be incomplete. A thought surfaced: DNA. The idea both terrified and compelled me. That night, I barely slept. Memories replayed in my mind, moments with my father, conversations with my mother, small details I had never questioned. The next morning, I ordered a DNA test online. Waiting for the results was agonizing. Every day felt stretched thin, filled with restless energy. I found myself analyzing old photos, comparing features, searching for similarities I had never noticed. 2 weeks later, the email arrived. My hands shook as I opened it. The results were clear. The man I had always believed was my biological father was not. A hollow feeling spread through my chest, like the floor beneath me had shifted. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. I wasn't angry, not at first. Mostly, I felt disoriented, as if I had stepped into a slightly altered version of my life where everything looked familiar but felt subtly wrong. Questions flooded my mind. Did my father know? Had my mother planned to tell me? Why keep this secret for so long? I returned to the box. Among the letters, I found one envelope that hadn't been opened. My name was written on the front. My heart pounded. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single letter, written in my mother's handwriting. My dearest, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here, and you have found what I was never brave enough to share while I was alive. Tears blurred my vision as I read. She wrote about the choices she had made, about loving my father deeply but also loving Daniel in a different way. She admitted that she had carried guilt for decades, not because she regretted my existence, but because she feared the day the truth might hurt me. There was never a moment, she wrote, when you were anything less than my greatest joy. Your father, the man who raised you, loved you completely. Biology does not measure love. She explained that Daniel had known, but they had agreed that my stability mattered most. If you choose to seek him out, she wrote, know that he cared for you from afar. At the bottom was a name and a city. I cried harder than I had at the funeral. Not from betrayal, but from the overwhelming realization of how complex her life must have been, how much she had carried silently. For several days, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to preserve the life I knew. Another part felt an undeniable pull, a need to understand, to connect. Eventually, I picked up the phone. The number rang twice. A man answered, his voice older but steady. When I introduced myself, there was a long pause, so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a quiet intake of breath. I've wondered if this day might come, he said softly. We talked for over an hour. He told me about his life, about the years he had spent respecting my mother's decision while quietly hoping I was happy. There was no bitterness in his voice, only warmth. A week later, we met at a small cafe. When he walked in, I recognized something immediately, not a physical resemblance exactly, but a familiar way of holding himself. We talked awkwardly at first, then more easily. He showed me photos, told stories about my mother when she was young, stories I had never heard. At one point, he said, "Your father raised a wonderful person. I'm grateful to him." That sentence stayed with me. Over the next months, we built a tentative connection. Not replacing anything, simply adding another layer to my understanding of where I came from. I visited my mother's grave one afternoon, the air cool and still. I told her I understood, or at least I was trying to. Standing there, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Grief still lingered, but it had softened, like edges worn smooth over time. Back at the house, I placed the letters and notebook back in the box. I repaired the lock and set it gently on the shelf, not hidden, but not displayed. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried forever. Some are meant to be discovered when we're ready to carry them. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the quiet and think about the many versions of my mother, the woman I knew, and the woman revealed through her words. I realize now that love is rarely simple. People make choices in complicated circumstances, trying their best with imperfect knowledge. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The truth doesn't erase the past. It deepens it. And in that depth, I've found a new kind of closeness, not just with her memory, but with myself. The house still makes the same soft sounds at night. The clock still loses a minute every week. But now, when I listen, I feel something different, not emptiness, but a quiet sense of connection, as if the pieces of my story, once scattered, have finally begun to settle into place.